Hello everybody, welcome back to the Premier Injuries channel. I don't know if you can tell, I've got a bit more of a rough voice than usual, but I'm back on the channel. As Ben tweeted out yesterday, I'm trying to get fully fit for the season ahead. But we are back with the injury analysis as always. Make sure to subscribe to the channel because we're the only place that gives you the most accurate and up-to-date injury information all through the season, whether you bet on the Premier League or if you're playing Fantasy Premier League as well. But yeah, Ben, how are you doing today and where are we kicking things off today?
First and foremost, Jay, great to have you back in the hot seat. As you see, I was lost yesterday without your area of expertise in video content and editing. So appreciate that and good to see you back. Look, where to start? Let's go to Everton. News broke late last night. El Buble confirmed that Dominic Calvert-Lewin had picked up a training ground injury. Now, the extent of which isn't unknown. As it currently stands, it's saying that he's a doubt for this game week, the opening weekend. However, you understand that the severity of that problem might be a little bit worse than what's being reported at this point. A lot of the main outlets are starting to reference that injury now, and he's certainly not part of any kind of training session today with Frank Lampard, the Athletic, Liverpool Echo. Now, this is one which is hugely disappointing for me because Dominic Calvert-Lewin was a player that I was potentially looking at, was flying under the radar. We know he had a very disappointing campaign last year. That was injury hampered, severely disrupted off the back of that Euros involvement, picked up the toe injury that went into his quad, and he kept on suffering what seemed like setback after setback. But if we can get anything like the Dominic Calvert-Lewin that played under Carlo Ancelotti, then you've got a really good player on your hands. And without Richarlison, I've seen Dominic Calvert-Lewin with a good solid pre-season under his belt being a really strong, viable FPL option. But now it seems certainly that he's going to be missing for the early game weeks potentially.
And this is the thing with Everton now, is they've lost Richarlison as well. So it's a massive, massive blow for them that he's not going to be starting. Just before I kind of do my kind of data analysis on that, hit for the team, does this kind of give you a worry that once again we might see the routine of Calvert-Lewin constantly kind of going between injury return, because this is exactly what happened last season. He was kind of flirting with return all the time and then he could just not get back into that fitness because of how physically demanding the Premier League is.
Yeah, it's a slightly different scenario. And of course, like I say, we're going to err on the side of caution at the minute. We don't have any kind of definitive diagnosis. We don't know the extent of the problem. It could be, fingers crossed, just a minor knock. Like I say, that only keeps him out for maybe a game or two. If it's more severe, that would be more of a worry. But this year, as opposed to last, of course, Dominic Calvert-Lewin was involved in the Euros, had very little game time at all at those championships. So instead of coming back and almost hitting the ground running and being fully fit, he was deconditioned. He missed a lot of that pre-season program and he had that toe injury as well. So that impacted on his ability to get back up to those, optimal levels, match fitness, a little bit of fatigue in there. Started the season, suffered those setbacks, and that's what started that, that sort of endless cycle of injuries and rehab, recovery, return, injury. This preseason had been going quite well for Dominic Calvert-Lewin. So the early signs there were really good. He was being protected by Frank Lampard. Again, on the understanding and the knowledge that really he's their main outlet following the departure of Richarlison and following on from what had happened last season. So for it to happen at this point, at training just during Tuesday's session, could be a huge loss for the Toffees.
Yeah, and last season the Toffees had one of their worst seasons. Looking at their underlying data, they really struggled in front of goal, and that ability for Calvert-Lewin to kind of get those goals is really emphasised by the fact that they underperformed their XG by about 5 goals. So, you're looking for that Calvert-Lewin and Richarlison to be able to match that sort of thing. And the other thing with Everton as well is Richarlison's absence is going to be hugely marked on the team because he was one of the most important players for getting points since he joined Everton. I think no players had more point winning goals than him. So, he was like the clutch player, Richarlison, and then Calvert-Lewin was consistently brilliant in front of goal. I mean, they're both really, really good players on their day, and it's just a massive loss. And just kind of harking back to that season that you're referencing, the one under Carlo Ancelotti, his goals per 90, 0.45 per 90 is pretty damn good in terms of Europe's top 5 leagues. He was managing an XG of 0.49 per 90, again in the top 15%. So he was a really important part of that team, and we shall see if they can kind of manage. It's just, who do you kind of imagine is going to come into the slot? Because Townsend is injured. Will it be Dele Alli? Because he's played as that kind of 9 role, deeper role, second striker at Tottenham. Is this possibly his opportunity to shine at Everton?
Well, look, I don't want to give too much away ahead of our podcast that will be released closer to the FPL deadline. But Dele Alli is in my initial draft heading into game week 1. So look, there's potential there. I really see this as a last chance saloon for Dele Alli. He certainly hasn't been pulling up any trees since he's arrived at Everton, and his demise from a player who was, lauded as one of the England's special talents, or certainly potential to go on and to really do big things. Has been, his fall from grace has been huge. So I think Dele Alli, with a little bit of love and a little bit of, an arm around the shoulder from Frank Lampard, can hopefully sort of deliver. He has been grabbing himself a couple of goals in pre-season. I still think it's a department which Frank Lampard will be looking at and hoping to strengthen. But why not? During these early game weeks, he has experience of playing in that position before. It's not somebody that I'd, as maybe as an Everton supporter, that I'd like to see there, throughout the course of the season. But, if we can see the Dele Alli of a few years back, then he can certainly fill that void, and help them through this sort of initial transition period, maybe until Dominic Calvert-Lewin gets back up to speed.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see him, and he's a 5.5 asset as well in terms of FPL, so he could be a good one. And I like some of those games that he's playing as well. So the Chelsea one is obviously a write-off for the Toffees, even though they are at home. But then Villa, Nottingham Forest, Brentford, Leeds, they're all possible games that they can score in. So game weeks 1 to 5, you've got 4 fairly good games in there. And again, in terms of, you said it's kind of a make or break for Dele Alli, I think it's a make and break season for the whole of the Everton team. Over the past few years, very questionable kind of signings, the kind of talent on show that they do have potential in that side to do well, but at the same time that there seems to be severe mismanagement. We shall see. If I'm honest, I wouldn't gamble on them just because I don't think Lampard's that good as a manager. I don't think that he's showed tactical competence, especially defensive-wise, and that's where Everton need to shore up, because they were in a relegation battle, not because of a lack of goals, even though they didn't score that many, but 43 goals was not horrendous in terms of last season. They weren't kind of in the bottom 5 even for that. It was the fact that they were just conceding so many goals, which put them, the fact that they're in the bottom 4 for that. That's where they really need to make their improvements. But yeah, so who else is the kind of big injury updates that we need to talk about, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, look, we'll stick with Everton just because you touched upon that, and a lot of people, I think, a lot of the importance of Yerry Mina cannot be understated as well. For Everton supporters will know that if you look at the points per game difference between when the Toffees start with Mina and when he's not, it's ridiculous. And he's a player who, like I say, on his day, fantastic, but those days don't come along too often because there's a lot of muscular problems. He did miss out actually last weekend with an injury, but that's believed to be minor. We are expecting Yerry Mina back on the training pitches ahead of game week 1, so fingers crossed with that one. Of course, he brought in James Tarkowski as well to try and shore up that defence. But There's still question marks with regards to Seamus Coleman. He had surgery earlier on in the summer. So does that mean that Patterson comes in possibly for his, again, after recovering from an injury and playing for Scotland during the summer? But, it's going to be a big, step up in a learning curve for him to fill those boots. So it remains to be seen. Elsewhere, Tottenham. We heard yesterday that East Basuma was flagged as a doubt. It looks like he's tweaked his hamstring playing against Roma last weekend. Now, one possible solution or alternative in that Tottenham midfield may have been Oliver Skipp. Initially, that was reported as a foot laceration, a training ground coming together, accidental with a teammate where the stud went into his foot. Quite gruesome by all accounts, required a lot of stitches, but further assessment and scan results have revealed an X-ray as a hairline fracture in what they report in the heel, in that concanial fracture in there. Now, because it's hairline, as an indication there that it's non-displaced, so it should respond quite well to conservative treatment, a little bit of rest, maybe partial immobilization. So we're looking maybe towards the end of August, maybe around 2-3 weeks before he is back in contention for Tottenham.
And so probably coming into the team then, this is something that we discussed with the Extra Inch podcast, the fantastic Chris Miller. If people want to listen to the whole thing, he explained that there is a little bit more depth in the midfield now this season. So Basuma was brought in to add that ability to kind of swap in and out of the midfield. So you got Højbjerg, who is an absolutely fantastic player, quite creative. But Bentancur will probably slot in there as well. Might not be the first choice situation, but also something that Chris Miller said, which I found fascinating, is nobody really knows what the best midfield is of Tottenham next season. It could be Højbjerg, Bentancur, it could be Basuma, Bentancur. It really depends on who clicks together and whatnot. So I don't think that'll be like a massive miss for them, because they played through most of last season with that kind of midfield setup anyway. They already know each other, Højbjerg, Bentancur, so I think that'll be all right. And a lot of their chance creation is kind of the wingers, isn't it? Those full-backs, and it's also the style of players. It's rather than individuals with Tottenham, it's the brilliance of the whole 11. So yeah, I'm not too worried in that sense, but also as an Arsenal fan, I am worried because they look really, really strong this season. So yeah, I think the loss of Basuma and Ollie Skipp is kind of a bit of annoyance. But my question to you, Ben, is will they be back for that kind of Champions League period? Because I think that's when we expect to see the most kind of rotation.
Yeah, like I say, Ollie Skipp, hopefully that's just a couple of weeks, maybe late August. It remains to be seen about East Basuma. The early indications suggest that it is just a minor tweak. So he isn't definitely ruled out of game week 1. And we know there's been issues there in the past, but it would make sense for Antonio Conte just to manage players. We know historically, re-injury, recurrence, rates for hamstring problems are high, and a slight tweak, a little bit of tightness can easily turn into a 3, a 4, a 5 week setback. So like I say, if it means holding him back just for a 7 or 10 days, then that would be the sensible decision. Another consideration with this Spurs team as well, and that's maybe with you mentioned those cup competitions, whether it be European or domestic, a lot of questions with regards to the fullbacks on both flanks of that Tottenham lineup. Namely, we have Perisic, who's returning off the back of that long-ish term calf problem, and also Matt Doherty on the opposite side, who had his season curtailed with that MCL problem. So, there's a lot of competition in those fullback places, and that'll come down to Antonio Conte. We know that he likes to drill his players. He likes them, to be in tip-top condition. And, who's going to have that starting berth? I think that remains to be seen. Like I say, it's an interesting conversation to have with regards to who's starting on the right and left-hand side.
I think as well, and this is part of the reason why I'm avoiding the fullbacks of Tottenham. They're going to be fantastic through the season, but who is going to start in certain periods as well. There will be a lot of rotation. There will be question marks. You know, if they've got a big Champions League game, maybe, you know, the first team starters, if you will, of potentially Perisic and Doherty might be rested for Spence and somebody else like Sessegnon. But then also through last season, we saw Sessegnon had incredible XGI per 90 numbers, you know, up there with some of the best players in the Premier League. So it's not cut and dry. It's not clear what is going to happen. And so for me, you know, well, I guess for both of us, Ben, something that we have echoed for the last few seasons is you have to have players that are going to start, because that's the best opportunity to even get points. If they're not starting, if they're coming off the bench, you're not going to get the clean sheet points. Yes, they might get you know, a late kind of goal involvement, but realistically for a defensive player, that's not often happens. So I would avoid for now, unless it becomes really, really clear that, you know, these are the first choice players and these are the cut players. But I think there's going to be constant rotation through the season. And then if you go, right, who do I like in the Tottenham back line? 5.0 Dyer. You know, he's going to be the focal point of their new and improved set pieces, because they brought in Gianni Vio as a set piece specialist. But even then, you'd say, well, how often do you score from set pieces? About 20% of team goals come from set pieces. It's not like Dyer will score every one of those. I'd rather spend that 5 million on somebody like Trippier or Cash or even Dinnery, because they're going to be more likely to be involved with goals. So unfortunately for me, Tottenham defence at the moment is an avoid. I don't know though if you have any kind of altering opinions. Would you roll the dice, Ben?
I mean, I hope you're not being influenced by you know, the red side of Jason on the, you know, on the shoulder there saying stay away from Tottenham. Look, I was on Eric Dyer last season, got in nice and early. It was a bit of a punt, great value for money. And again, I don't want to divulge too much information, but he is in that initial draft as well. I like Tottenham. I like what Antonio Conte is doing. I'm staying away from the midfield for the reasons I can't get involved in those fullbacks at the moment. So the only solution that I had was to go for somebody like Eric Dyer in that back line, or Lloris. But I have me goalkeeper stitched up elsewhere as well. And of course, you know, you've got those pick of the talent up top. So, you know, I am sniffing around Eric as it currently stands.
Well, just as well to confirm that I'm not looking at this season bias. I do have Son in my team, so you know I'm starting the season with him, which is very different to a lot of other teams. I don't have Haaland, I don't have De Bruyne. I'm starting the season with Heung-min Son, so you know you can't call me biased because I do have the wonderful Son in my team. So let's turn our attention to one of the listeners' questions. Blonde FPL has asked, are we going to be living the dream? Will Ward be a 4.0 goalkeeper to start the season?
I mean, the long and the short of it, we just don't know for certain. The concern is Ward picked up that injury while he was away with Wales earlier in the season, and he's only been involved in very little individual training. I haven't had any confirmation of this, but he was scheduled or penciled in to play behind closed doors friendly on Monday. Even if he did, you know, he's still 4-6 weeks behind the rest of his teammates. Now, if that was an outfield player, I would be more concerned. For goalkeeping duties, then not so much. But there is a little bit of sharpness in there. I mean, as it currently stands, you know, Kasper Schmeichel is still at the club, first and foremost. So, you know, regardless of rumours and suggestion that he is gone, and I know that Brendan Rodgers didn't start him at the weekend and left him on the bench with Tielemans. A lot of people are reading into that. A lot of people reading into the tweet that I posted about Wesley Fofana and Brendan Rodgers quote, which we can come upon later. But look, I think once fully fit, he puts himself in the frame. The issue will be is how Leicester start. And if I'm trying to think of his name, what's his name, Jason? The new Leicester goalkeeper, Sarjic. Is that right? Have I got that right?
I didn't even know they signed one, if I'm honest.
Yeah. So it's basically the two vying for that position. If I've got that right, I'm gonna have to check that out. This is what happens when you go live, you see, and you get caught on the hop by these listeners' questions. Give us a look. But anyway, this new Leicester goalkeeper, I have got Sargis right. Now it's Iverson. I absolutely blew that, didn't I? So Iverson and Ward are going to be competing and vying for that number one spot. Difficulty is going to be if Leicester get off to a good start and Iverson starts well, then Ward's going to find himself down the pecking order at number two, and it's going to be a mistake that really allows him or affords him that opportunity to break into the team. So unfortunately, this knee problem, which he had surgery on, then he's had that minor sort of setback and recurrence. That's come at a bad time. It was an opportunity during pre-season to really go out there and prove himself and really sort of lay down a marker for him and putting his name forward for that number one spot. But maybe fitness-wise, it'll be Iverson that maybe gets the nod in game week one. But of course, like I say, I stress that Schmeichel is still there at the moment. We've heard it lots of times before, players touting a move away. Until it's signed, sealed, and delivered elsewhere, then, he's still under consideration and still in a manager's plans.
I mean, the thing is as well with Leicester, I guess, Blonde FPL, I don't know if you're asking because you want to play Ward each game, but I would be totally staying away from Leicester defensive assets until they prove themselves worthy, because last season they were absolutely appalling in terms of numbers. They were bottom half of the table, 59 goals conceded, XG conceded of 70, so like a massive overperformance there for a team that really, lacking in a lot of quality. I think, looking at the fact that they're going to lose, again, we don't like to go into the rumour too much, but it looks like they will lose quite a few of their important players. Tielemans, like you said, was benched. We don't know if he's going, but the kind of rumours are strong that he'll be departing. Looking at that team, I don't trust in them to turn it around, as well as the fact that Brendan Rodgers, he's not a fantastic defensive manager. He doesn't seem to have that in him. So it'd be a big avoid for me. They've lost a couple of their big players as well to injury in this preseason period. You got Ricardo. He's a big loss, and he's never really returned to his kind of levels as well. So I don't know. I think it could be fun that there's a 4.0 goalkeeper, but at the same time, realistically, I'd have him on my bench as backup to my 4.5 goalkeeper, but I wouldn't play him because Leicester are just not very good. But let's turn our attention, and we'll probably.
Jay, I just want to jump in there, just defensively, the Wesley Fofana thing as well, because I put something out last night, and it was a quote from Brendan Rodgers following their final game on Sunday, and I'll actually read the quote direct because it got misinterpreted or Twitter done its thing, and we know that Wesley Fofana's linked to Chelsea, and again that might impact on any decision with regards to just adding to what you said. Defensively, they're not very good, and they're losing players, and potentially one of their linchpins in that back line may be away. But Brendan Rodgers was quoted and asked why Wesley Fofana was substituted at half time on Sunday, and his words were, he had a slight groin injury going into the game, so we wanted to manage that. Felt he was okay to play, but the idea was to get the minutes in and get him off safe so he can move on. So everybody, I posted this and never really thought much of it, but it blew up, and everybody was like, Brendan Rodgers, what you doing? What you said? He move on. That's him done. Signed, sealed, delivered to Stamford Bridge. Of course, that wasn't the case. He was referencing that injury last season, psychologically, how much that had impacted on him. They wanted to get some minutes in his legs to build that confidence again, just to get him back up to the pace so they can move on and focus on game week 1. Nothing else. Nothing else at this moment in time. I'm not saying the move to Chelsea hasn't been touted and isn't a possibility, but I'm certainly not saying that, Brendan Rodgers, just to clarify, wasn't saying that he was getting him fit or keeping him right for Chelsea, because that, like I say, is, as far as I'm concerned at the moment, just a little bit of conjecture, a little bit of rumour with regards to that. So Wesley Fofana should be absolutely fine for game week 1.
Well, this is the thing as well. We always say to people, we don't like to engage in rumour, misinformation. We just tell you the straight facts and that clarification there. I mean, I read that as well. Obviously, we talk a lot, off air. I just read that as he can move on from his injury, but obviously people will read into it as they wish. But one of the, I think, biggest injury blows this week has come at Fulham. And talking of manager quotes, we've had their manager kind of come out and say the situation at the club is not ideal. He doesn't think that the team are ready for the Premier League. But the loss of Harry Wilson, now this was a breaking one, kind of when we were talking live on air. You were still gathering the information. We may do a single show if people are interested enough on this, because he is an integral part of that team. So I'll go into the data in a moment. But Ben, what is the latest on that?
I mean, the latest is that there isn't a great deal of information out there. The injury that we know occurred in a behind closed doors friendly. Therefore, we have no video footage. We have no mechanism. We're just trying to interpret what Marco Silva was saying with regards to the problem, and it doesn't look like it's good news, suggesting an indication that it could be long term. Now, one man's long term, what does that actually mean? Best case scenario, if we're talking maybe some meniscal damage to that cartilage, or MCL or LCL, then maybe we're looking in and around that region of 2 to possibly 4 months. Depends, obviously, if surgical intervention is required. If it's something more substantial, significant in terms of maybe a cruciate ligament, whether that be an ACL or a posterior cruciate ligament, like I say, we don't know at this point, then we're going to extend that timeline significantly. So, if those initial fears are confirmed, then, Fulham could be lucky to see Harry Wilson this side of the World Cup. It may be that we're looking at early next year. Don't forget that the season breaks around about, I think it's November the 11th or 12th. So, we've got roughly sort of 3 months between game week 1 and before that break. And like I say, reading between the lines of what he's saying, it may be difficult to see Harry Wilson back in that Fulham midfield before then.
And that's deeply concerning for Fulham on so many levels. Harry Wilson was probably the only player I would have potentially considered in the Fulham team. One of the reasons why was because Fulham were quite good on set pieces last season. They were actually 4th best for total goals on dead ball situations in the Championship. And I referenced him earlier, the man who has gone to Tottenham, the set piece specialist, Gianni Vio. He has an amazing quote that said, set pieces are a 20 goal a season striker that never gets injured. And so, going up from the Championship to the Premier League, Harry Wilson might have been able to continue some sort of level of output with the kind of situations that Fulham find themselves in. Further up the pitch, his ball delivery was fantastic, but also he could assist, but he could also score from those dead ball situations as well. But in terms of it, looking at Fulham, they've lost Carvalho. Now, he wasn't a creative 10. He was more of a kind of going for goal kind of 10. But he's such a big loss to the team. Harry Wilson is probably their biggest creative player. So last season, he had 29 goal involvements, 10 goals, 19 assists. He was 3rd best for expected assists per 90 in the Championship all of last season. 4th most creative player in terms of chances created per 90. His numbers were pretty damn good, ridiculous. And so that's going to be a huge loss to the team. Some people that are gambling on Mitrovic in their teams, that fully just kind of removes any sort of interest that I would have in him. You know, Mitrovic, he's still a differential, but he's 7.1% owned. Those are difficult-ish games at the start of the season, but at the same time, it's just kind of looking at it, it just removes any sort of interest that I'd have in Fulham players at all. And it's really sad because, you know, talking of it, they're back in the Premier League. They want to start the season as well as they could. We talked to Sonia Twig. Again, people can check out that video. But it was kind of hopeful that they'd pick up some points in those tough initial games. Where's that going to come from? Where are the goals going to come from now? Because the chances aren't going to be created. And defensively, they're going to be quite open. Is quite a worry.
It is. It is. And look, I'm not dipping into that Fulham market. I remember 2 seasons ago when they came up, and I'm positive they played Arsenal. Was it Arsenal Liverpool at a 12:30 kickoff on the Saturday, and I was all over Joe Bryan. I looked at the data. The flying fullback, he was getting involved in everything at that second tier, and he was my player under the radar. He was the player that was going to, you know, shine a light. I had unearthed a gem. Well, I was going to swear, that kind of garbage, I think would be the word that I'd use.
Flipping garbage.
Yeah. They got absolutely butchered on that day. Was it 3-0? They were never at the races. And I think it was Arsenal. I'm sure Aubameyang might have got 2. Very disappointing. You know, there's always lots of talk about Alexander Mitrovic. Look, he can do it on the international stage. He can certainly do it at that second tier. It just continues to disappoint in the Premier League. At Newcastle, I hold my hands up and I would say probably wasn't given a fair crack of the whip. I don't know what was going on off the pitch, but, you know, certainly I think it was under Rafa. You know, he wasn't given that opportunity to go out and play. So no, I'm not getting involved in any of those Fulham assets initially. But I'm going to move the conversation because there is something that I was going to throw out a bit of a Dinnery differential to you.
Love it.
And I've been looking at Brentford, and there's part of me thinking, right, well, how are Brentford going to cope without the Christian Eriksen? Yes, they started last season really well. Then they went through that lull, and then Christian Eriksen sort of came on board, and they finished the season like a steam train, done really, really well. Now, Bryan Mbeumo is obviously being reclassified now as a forward. So looking at those midfield options potentially in that Brighton, and I'm going to throw in Christian Norgard, who would actually have been he's a £5.5 million player. He would have been the highest scoring midfield player had Bryan Mbeumo been a forward. He's just come back from injury. He had been nursing a minor issue. Thomas Frank said when he came on at the weekend, he changed he changed the game. It was completely different. You know, he's a Rolls Royce player in that Brentford team. And he's a player that I see a lot of potential in there. I'm just not convinced that Brentford can cope with the loss of Christian Eriksen, because for me, that changed the whole dynamic and the whole play of Ivan Toney. I think that allowed him to maybe play a little bit higher up in the pitch, stay in those areas which were dangerous. You know, we've seen on the opening game, was it last season? Ivan Toney come with this big fanfare, a lot of hope, aspirations. And, at times he was defending at fullback. You know, he was all over the pitch. As an FPL owner, as somebody that you bring into your team to score goals, you don't want to see him anywhere near that third sort of quadrant, that defensive quadrant of the pitch. You want him up there pushing. And my worry would be, without Eriksen, does he feel he has the role or the responsibility to maybe try and drop a little bit deeper to link up that play with Bryan Mbeumo playing a little bit higher up?
Well, it will be really, really interesting. I'm quite keen on the Brentford team because they finished the season quite well. I quite often like to gravitate towards teams that have finished the season well, because that they're going into the next season with kind of positivity, whatever that you kind of describe it. Psychologically, they're on a high, and there's a reason why they must have ended well. They must be playing quite well. But as you said, the kind of elephant in the room with any sort of discussions about Brentford is Eriksen. They started the season really well. The middle part of the season, 20 games, I can't remember how many points they picked up, something like 14. Really, really poor run. But what I would say is the positive around that is they underperformed their data. So they were still doing good, but they didn't achieve that kind of data output. And to me, part of that problem, as you well know, was the fact that they had a lot of injuries during that period. It was kind of almost like a perfect storm at the end of the season. All the players were coming back to full fitness. Eriksen came in. They're fantastic. But I think the biggest question in terms of Norgard, in terms of Tony, in terms of all their kind of attacking assets, which is why I'm gambling, is will they continue in the 4-3-3 formation? I think that's where the big question is. If Norgard is played as an 8, like Eriksen was, then he will do bits. He's a really creative player, quality, and behind Eriksen, only he was behind Eriksen in terms of the kind of data created per 90. Some of his data was a little bit better than Eriksen's in terms of chance created. So if he doesn't have to play the kind of deeper role that was facilitated by the 5-3-2 formation, then maybe he'll be let off to kind of have those opportunities. I think the fact that Brentford are signing, is it Damsgaard? From I can't remember the Serie A team, but he's another forward. I think they're looking at playing the 4-3-3 because they bought. Is it Keane Potter? Was that the guy that they signed from Hull? Might have made that name up.
Lewis Potter.
Lewis Potter, that's it. Lewis Potter.
We covered this in a preview, I'm sure, Jason, before. So
yeah,
it's not like you to let one slip. It must be the COVID kicking in.
Yeah, it's the COVID, mate. I'll blame that. No, names I'm not brilliant with. I sometimes, especially the pronunciation. But that's the big thing, is probably if they continue the 4-3-3, I think Tony looks a fantastic asset because, as you mentioned there, Bryan Mbeumo, he tried his best, but he was, I think, from memory, the biggest underperformer on XG per 90. Yeah, I've got the data up just now. Bryan Mbeumo had minus 0.18 goals per 90 compared to his XG, which was some of the worst finishing in Europe, not even just in the Premier League. That was the bottom 4th percentile, like truly horrendous stuff. So it was the fact that Tony had to kind of come a little bit deeper. He was creating from the midfield. He wasn't in the centre because it was the 5-3-2. So Tony was coming deeper and Mbeumo was coming in. I guess he's good as a winger and he's good for the team, but his finishing abilities really need working on. And then once they went to that 4-3-3 position, again, Eriksen was there to create a lot of these opportunities, but Ivan Toney went to having the 8th best XG in the Premier League during that time, and the team itself had the 6th best chance creation numbers in the Premier League during that time. So I think Norgard could be a really interesting option if he's played as an 8, but if I'm going to spend money on Brentford attackers, it's going to be Tony, and he's a big differential. Not many people have got him in. He's only 5.3% owned, 7 million, starts week in, week out. If he's the focal point of that team, he's going to do well. But I wouldn't mind rolling the punt on Norgard as well. I mean, one of the ones that I compare people to, a lot of people have gone to Neto, don't really like him. So I was looking at Fornals, but Norgard as well. I mean, who do you think would get the most minutes out of Fornals and Norgard?
I see Norgard once fully fit and up to speed as a nailed down starter, held in very high regard and esteem by Thomas Franks. Fornals, look, there's a lot of players in those attacking areas. Ben Rama, Antonio, Lanzini can even play in there as well. So, I still see David Moyes rotating and resting players in and around that, particularly maybe as we get into those congested areas in and around cup competitions. So for me, the minutes would go with Norgard. I do like Fornals. I do think he's a good player. I do think he brings a lot. But, we keep on banging the drum. It's about starts and minutes for us. It doesn't matter how good you are if you're not on the pitch. You're not able to deliver or contribute anything at all. But the only concern with me, obviously West Ham, you're expecting to maybe, use last season as a springboard and build and go further again. Brentford, I just have that nagging little bit of doubt in my mind about, how much the loss of Christian Eriksen's going to affect. And even those players coming in to bolster the squad and build up the squad, there's going to be a period of, adaptation to acclimatise to the rigours of the league. So that would be the only worry. But, see, in terms of minutes, it's got to be Norgard.
We've got a message here from Nathan. He says, big up from Jamaica. So nice
yeah,
to
man.
see. We've got global viewing here. Carlos Munoz has asked us thoughts on Lewis Potter. I mean, it's a good question. In terms of you, Ben, first and foremost, do you think he's going to get the minutes in the team? Because, again, it all comes back to this question. Are these people going to play?
It's difficult. Look, there's a lot of competition for places, and no doubt the kid's got a big future ahead of him. The long and the short of it is, I don't want to read too much into preseason. We're all guilty of doing that at some point. A player grabs your attention, you see a result, you see a performance. But when it comes to the cut and thrust of the Premier League, there's nothing quite like that. So really, when players are coming in from the outside, when they're being blooded in, I need to see the eye test. And I need to see them, for myself and how they're performing and maybe how they can develop and how they can be utilised within the team. Now, injuries, suspensions, even results and performances will impact on how teams will be set up and how players are utilised. But for me, during those early game weeks, I don't see him as a nailed down starter.
I mean, the thing is he's been bought for a reason. And looking at the data of Brentford last season, one of the biggest problems that they had was dribbling. They didn't have somebody who could carry the ball to create chances that way. They actually had the second lowest distance covered with carries and only 3 goals created from dribbles. Whereas Lewis Potter, absolutely fantastic in terms of creating chances from his dribbling. He's so good with the ball. He was Hull City's top scorer with 12 last season. Great creator from open play, 5.1 XA, 52 chances created, some of the best data in the Championship, and he averaged 0.37 XGI per 90 in the Championship as well. But what was interesting was he was joint 5th for total chance creating carries, 13 per 90. So this is something about ball progression that the Brentford team were lacking. And so if he plays that inside forward, again in the 4-3-3, the players that Brentford are bringing in, hopefully he does get some minutes. But again, I kind of echo your point is I probably wouldn't bring him in, but the fact that he's been bought and Damsgaard as well suggests to me that the 4-3-3 is going to be played. And so that's a real positive for me. So Nathan has asked about Bailey. He said, Bailey spent loads of time with Sterling this summer. Bailey wants to get to his level so bad. Thank me later. To answer kind of around Nathan's point, is he somebody that you think is going to get the minutes this season, Ben?
Potentially. Look, there's a lot of question marks with regards to fitness concerns. Yeah, he's worked very hard, and we've seen this before. Leon Bailey was a player that burst onto the scene. And I mentioned this on the last pod, we were watching it live, I'm sure. I think we were doing maybe a hot mic record, and and he came off the bench and he grabbed those 2 goals. Was it against Everton? The second one being a worldie, suffered that setback and never really recovered and recaptured anything like that form. So we know the potential, we know the pedigree from his background. It's whether he can stay fit and consistent. And again, the jury's a little bit out with that one. So I prefer the eye test. Now, if that means that I'm going to have to wait maybe 2 or 3 game weeks just to see how he beds in, to see how Steven Gerrard sets his team up, to see how he comes through those early games, there's a risk there that, yes, look, he might be on a hot streak from day one and I may miss out on points. But I'm prepared to take that risk, just given, like I say, I'm urgent caution with Leon Bailey. For me, just to the prospect that, like I say, there's those injury niggles and those inconsistencies are a little bit of a worry. You know what? And if he does come in, great, and do well, then I'm happy to jump on. But, just a quick going back to the Lewis Potter scenario, I always look at those, the last games of pre-season as maybe a good indication about how teams are likely to set up. And it was Norgard who started against Real Betis, and it was Lewis Potter that came on as sub and seen the game out. So, like I say, that's maybe a bit of an indication that Lewis Potter will be more introduced, from the bench, certainly during those early games. He's only a 21-year-old lad. He's still, cutting his teeth and learning his trade. So, it's a big step up the Premier League for him.
I think on to the point with Leon Bailey, kind of looking at Aston Villa's data last season under Steven Gerrard, the main problem has been their ability to go forward. The team really struggled with high quality, big chances created data. So they were 6th for chances created in the league when they were playing under Steven Gerrard, but they were really lacking with actually creating high quality chances. If Leon Bailey can replicate his season at Bayer Leverkusen, the 2020-21 campaign, he creates a lot from his dribbles. His XA per 90 was in the top 20 percentile, 0.26. And his passing is pretty good. But I think it's his movement and his ability to kind of distract defenders, whatever, that could give them an extra foible up front. But the reality is he's going to be competing with, is it Coutinho, Buendia, him? It depends if they play a 2 up top, if they play a 1 up top, do they go back to the diamond formation? Again, it's the rotational risk. I think Coutinho is probably the safest bet out of all those players in there. The fact that he's their big money signing. What I do like about some aspects with Aston Villa is Boubacar Kamara coming in. I think that will shore up their defence even more with Diego Carlos. And that in turn may allow the likes of the other players to be creative and more free going up front, because I think Gerrard's biggest problem when he came into the club last season was sorting out their appalling defence. But for me, Boubacar Kamara, Diego Carlos, a stronger defence for me says Cash, Digne are the ones to have. I think, again, it's that starting kind of position. It's why I'm kind of easing away from players like him. They got potential, but we've not seen it yet. And also, the Bundesliga is very different from the Premier League. They're totally different in terms of physical demands. And partly, this is speculation from me, so Ben, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe the reason why he struggled with fitness in his first season is because of that physicality. And can that take even longer for him to kind of adapt to that?
You hope now that first season, there's so many influencing factors on why players may suffer. You talk new environment, new intensities, new positions, new tactics, different demands on the body from positional changes, different roles within the team. You would hope now that, he's well ingrained with that setup, and Steven Gerrard, he fully understands his role and he's playing, he's adapted to that. He used a solid pre-season, this opportunity to get himself fully fit to be ready for this upcoming campaign. So, fingers crossed that happens. As we know, football, it's a contact sport. There are no guarantees with anything, but at least he's put himself in the best position to try and mitigate that risk of any setbacks. And yeah, like you say, Jason, the cut and thrust of the Premier League is quite different to anything that's out there, both in terms of distance covered, maybe high intensity sprints and so on. So, that's difficult, especially when you're an explosive, tricky winger, like Leon Bailey is. The expectations of him to go out and produce and create something, that's different because the eyes of almost the world are on the Premier League. It's the most watched game in the world. So the pressures in and around that as well come into consideration. But look, like I say, if he can fulfill that potential, if he can stay fit, he's going to be a massive asset for the Villains.
So we've got a question from Coys. I guess they're a Spurs fan. And I think what's interesting with this question, that they've given us their FPL team, but we will answer individually, I guess, on some of the players, because I think Sanchez, Trent Alexander-Arnold, Robertson, Cancelo, Cash are fine assets. We don't really need to discuss them. But one of the ones that I find fascinating is Martinelli. So kind of looking at him, Ben, what's the latest injury news on Emile Smith-Rowe? Because that could hugely impact on, Martinelli basically starting from game week 1.
That's a nice segue, that, Jason, because I actually had Emile Smith-Rowe teed up for the next update there. So, and by the way, we haven't discussed that. So that really well. Now, the long and the short of it is, as with Emile Smith-Rowe, and I suspect Kieran Tierney, Tomiyasu, and Vieira, all of those players we know have had heavily disrupted pre-season programs, minimal minutes for Emile Smith-Rowe. Now, Mikel Arteta had come out and he said, look, we're expecting everybody to be available as such ahead of Friday night's game. The reality of the situation is all 4 of those players are severely lacking in terms of match fitness and sharpness. So I would expect none of those players to be in contention, certainly for a start. Now, Emile Smith-Rowe. Now, this is a groin issue that's dragged on since December last year. We don't know if there's anything underlying, but certainly it's something that was being managed. It was something that was flagged by Mikel Arteta on several occasions. And again, it sort of reared its ugly head during this pre-season program. Now, like I say, the decision to maybe manage this injury conservatively is a slight concern. If it keeps on happening, maybe he requires something, maybe surgery to remedy something or what have you. But the long and the short of it is, Emile Smith-Rowe is out of game week 1. We expect him to rejoin the group by the middle of next week, which in theory puts him in contention for game week 2, certainly to be included in that matchday squad.
So realistically then, he might be sniffing at the door once again by game week 2. It's not confirmed then that it is kind of a long-term thing.
Yeah, I mean, look, just in terms of his sharpness and match fitness, having missed, several weeks, I think realistically, if we're talking about pushing for a start, then game week 3 at the very earliest, maybe game week 4 is more realistic. But then again, you need to contextualise that. If Arsenal start, like a freight train and they're winning 3 and 4 games off the bounce, and the team's playing, really attractive, cohesive football, Martinelli et al. Are all impressing, then, Mikel Arteta isn't going to shake things up too much. So, once you've got that jersey, if you can keep it and earn it, through your performances, then, he's there to stay. So it's important that Martinelli needs to grasp this opportunity that's being provided because of injuries, we think, with both hands. And if he can perform and if he can, hopefully get on the score sheet and provide goals, then, I think that it's his share to lose.
I think as well with the Martinelli situation, especially at his price point as well, he's not too expensive, 6.0. What I love about him tactically with the whole of the Arsenal kind of forwards is they've got like a liquid front 3. They're kind of 1 minute Martinelli's an inside forward, then he's through the middle, whereas Jesus has kind of gone into his position. Then he's out on the right-hand side playing as a more traditional winger. It's going to confuse defenders. They're going to have lots of third-man runs. It's going to present a lot of opportunities for all of those kind of front 3 to do really, really well. I mean, if he can, like you said, if they can start the season quite well, if he can get in the goals or assists, he could be a fantastic cheap asset. And I think he's worth the gamble. With the fact that we're all going to be playing our wild cards pretty early in the season, couple that with the fact that he's only 6.0, so you can easily kind of move your money around. You'll have transfers in the early part of the season. It's not like you kind of stuck with him no matter what. If he's starting week in, week out, he's a great way into what is going to be a much improved Arsenal attack. Last season, they improved quite a bit in attack already, so the team actually kind of regressed a little bit in defence, but they improved their XG difference per 90 because the attack actually improved as well. Martinelli could be the cheapest way in. Obviously, the only negative side is Smith Rowe can compete with him, whereas the fact that Jesus and Saka are more nailed, and obviously Saka also has the penalty duties too. So it's a difficult one. But I would say for come on you Spurs person, you can kind of safely do that because they've got a fairly kind of robust squad as well, because they've got Neto and Andreas Pereira as well. I guess that brings us nicely as well onto the Neto discussions. He had a fairly big injury last season. He played the last few games of the season. But what do you think? Will he be still handled conservatively this season?
There's no reason why not. He made that return fairly early in the year. A lot of people tried to jump on, but unsurprisingly, there were a couple of little setbacks. There was another little foot problem in there, and his season really sort of petered out. Again, there was nothing great there. I don't really know what stoked the fires, for this buzz around Neto. Maybe it's his price point. Wolves have scored a few goals in pre-season and are looking a lot more able to, or certainly in a better position they were this time last year to hit the ground running under Bruno Lage. Again, I'm still not convinced. I was hugely disappointed by them last year, and because of that, I'm not able to get enthused with this Pedro Neto backing. There's still question marks. We've seen the setback for Raul Jimenez. Fabio Silva's went out on loan. Chan has missed a large chunk of pre-season with a hamstring issue. So again, there's a lot of question marks in that Wolves attack. And maybe that's why people are thinking, well, then that nails Pedro Neto for a starting berth. But Adama Traore also with a hamstring issue. He's back from his loan spell in Spain. In terms of his injury, the expectation is, he's over that. Yes, it was a significant setback, and maybe he's still yet to get back to those pre-injury levels. And look, he's a talent, but I'm just not sold on this Wolves team.
Exactly the same as you, Ben. Looking at their underlying data for last season, going forward, they were absolutely appalling. They were relegation level, and in terms of their defensive data as well, they got really, really lucky. Jose Sarr was incredible last season in terms of XG prevented. You look at their data, they were in the bottom 5 for XG conceded. They should have conceded 65 goals. They only conceded 43. It's not sustainable. I think this season, especially if they don't make any more signings, they've got big problems on their hands. Bruno Lage, the way that he plays, it's almost like turgid defensive football. There's nothing going forward. It's really boring. And for 5.5, I guess it's one of those punts, kind of like we're talking about with Norgard, with Fornals. There's lots of question marks over it, but I'd rather spend 5.5 on a defender. Somebody, again, Trippier. He's going to be part of a Newcastle team, starts week in, week out. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's a big avoid for me. There's nothing really positive about Wolves at all. We've got a really good question. This is something that we've covered quite a lot. We'll probably be finishing in the next couple of minutes because we'll have been on for an hour then, Ben. And we've got your team reveal to do as well. I mean, that's really exciting. Not in this video. People can watch out for it. It'll be on the channel a little bit later today. But Slav Cho has asked, do you think Ben Chilwell will start the majority of games considering he recently recovered from ACL injury, or will they heavily manage his minutes? I mean, this is a really good question. We actually released an article yesterday around ACL injuries, Jakob Moder's kind of injury, with Dr. Matt Preventure, one of the world's leading specialists in ACL injuries. So if people want to read that or watch the video is fantastic as well. He kind of answers return to play, realistic kind of data outputs of these players. But yeah, Ben, looking at Ben Chilwell, do you think that this season he's going to come back any sort of level or of output that he's had previously?
I mean, he will certainly hope so. In his own mind, he'll be targeting a place in that England squad at the Qatar World Cup. I think that will be his end goal for this first part of the season. The reality of the situation, he did return to that Chelsea matchday squad, game week 38 last season. He wasn't ready. I think by his own admission, he was very apprehensive, almost scared. I think he sort of referenced he hadn't even taken part in a full training session. So statistically, yes, it made sure that he had, a 6 month to 7 month spell on the sidelines. The reality of the situation is, most players, first and foremost, it's an 8 to 10, 11 month recovery period, and then return to play is not necessarily return to performance. Dr. Matt Preventure, again, we talked about this. It's not the first season back, it's the second season. We've seen that with Virgil van Dijk, post ACL recovery, had a half decent season coming back. Last season, he was back to almost sort of pre-injury levels. Now, a lot of supporters, or there's a lot of suggestion that the links with Cucurella from Brighton to Chelsea are an indication that maybe Thomas Tuchel is a little bit wary of Ben Chilwell. Maybe he's concerned that, again, he's not going to hit those pre-injury levels. For me, again, it's about maybe managing player load, about giving him the opportunity to play himself back in, not have the pressures of them needing to perform week in and week out with no sort of viable option to come in and around him. Of course, Marcos Alonso is available as well. But look, I think it's just sensible management from Thomas Tuchel, strengthening that squad, bolstering up in positions. It's not now that you need one or even two players, outstanding players in one position. Sometimes it calls for three players in there, and having a little bit of a flexibility and versatility within the squad to be able to change things up. I don't necessarily will see Ben Chilwell consistently, and I think that's the key word, consistently back to his pre-injury levels during this first half of the campaign. I certainly think it's going to take a little bit of time. I think his minutes could be managed by Thomas Tuchel. We know, which was such a surprise why he was included in the squad. Thomas Tuchel has been very meticulous in integrating and gradually introducing those players back into the squad post-injury last season. So I expect more of that. And like I say, it's not a player that I would be looking to own in FPL. On the opposite side, on the right hand side, Reece James is a player. If he can stay fit and, like I say, have a good summer, work hard, if he can avoid those problems that hampered him last season, I see him as a much better and much more viable option in that Chelsea defence.
Yeah, and the heartbreaking thing as well with Ben Chilwell, ridiculously good data. Top 1 percentile for goals per 90 for fullbacks, XG per 90 in the top 2%. When he was on his day, he was one of the best, not just in the Premier League, in Europe. Ridiculous kind of output numbers, passing, creating. He was up there. And hopefully he can return to that. But as you said there, statistically, from Dr. Matt Preventure, one of the best experts on ACL injuries in the world, realistically, 2 years is the second season is when they come back. We've got one last question from Nathan. That will be our last one for today. He's asked, not much mention in the community about Saliba, Doherty or Virgil van Dijk. Who's the best chance to replace the defensive bigs? So I guess we can approach this from a couple of ways. I guess Saliba, I'll quickly kind of, with the Arsenal situation, I see Saliba as kind of maybe a rotational thing. So I wouldn't have him in my FPL team because you're not sure if he starts week in, week out. You've got Ben White, Gabriel as the kind of set two. But he does offer that kind of aerial threat when he's in the team. Doherty, we've kind of mentioned with Tottenham, again, the rotational problem. But Virgil van Dijk, I guess, in terms of the defensive bigs, maybe we can turn it into a question of who's got the aerial ability, Ben. I mean, would you consider Virgil van Dijk as an asset? Because he does score a lot of goals from set pieces. He was just behind Gabriel last season for getting the ball into the back of the net. Fantastic sort of data. I mean, he's a good one. You know, you look at the likes of West Ham as some of the best, Brentford, Arsenal, Liverpool. These are the kind of best teams at set pieces. Defensive bigs, Virgil van Dijk, he's got to be up there, doesn't he?
At the risk of giving too much away, Van Dijk is in my draft team.
Oh God, we're
He's
releasing
there.
it.
Look, you know me, I like to try and stay away from the template. I try to stay away from those players with really high ownership numbers. And of course, I want to slice of Liverpool. Trent, by far, is the standout player for me. I never even considered him, in all honesty, just given the fact that, let's have a look at his ownership as we talk. 58%. You know, he's not getting anywhere near my team at 58%, unfortunately. Then I looked at Robbo. Robbo, you know, in hindsight, and I'd look back and think he had an outstanding season last year. Really good. 7 million. I think it was 186 points. Done really, really well. But then I was quite surprised to learn that Van Dijk was only 3 points behind him. Comes in at £500,000 less. His ownership is slightly higher than Robbo this season. I think Robbo's around 11, Virgil van Dijk 13. So that I was a little bit surprised at that. But just like I say, just to change things up, and I'm all over Van Dijk because he like I say, he's a bit of a Rolls Royce player. He's a centre half. You know, I think he's going to start the majority of games, regardless of rotation around cups and European fixtures. Whereas you can see maybe Jurgen Klopp can utilise maybe some of those other players in those fullback roles, as we did see with Trent and Robbo in the past. You know, James Milner coming in, Curtis Jones getting dropped in there, Konstantinos dropping in there as well. So there's loads of options in that back line. In the centre back, you've got Matip, you've got Van Dijk, and you've got Konate. They're your three sort of standout centre backs. And for me, it's Van Dijk that starts, and it's the Matip Konate rotation. So, you know, we're going back to the premise of not only is he a great player, but he's a player who's going to be playing the majority of minutes.
And the thing is, as well, is he's got some fairly good data to kind of back it up as well. He's got 3.47 XGI. He had 32 shots inside the box last season. So amongst defenders, that's the third most. The only two players that have had more shots inside the box, but I guess you can call them headers inside the box because that's what the majority of them will be, was Matip, as you mentioned, and Laporte, who draws with him with 32. You know, he's got that ability. He's got that threat from set pieces. He's brilliant. But he also has the ability from assisting from open play as well because of his incredible passing ability. You know, at times he's like a midfield maestro, you know, creating for that team. So there's a lot to love about Van Dijk. I really love it as a differential pick. 6.5, you can save yourself, put that money elsewhere in the team. He's probably one of the only centre backs where you'd go, fair enough, you know, he's not a wing back or a full back, but he's probably just as attacking because Liverpool are just insane on set pieces. But that is the end of our discussions today. I've got through it, Ben, with the lurgy that I've had, COVID, and I only made one mistake with calling Lewis Potter Keen Potter.
King Lewis Potter.
I think his name is Keen Lewis Potter, so maybe that's why I made the COVID riddled mistake. But for now, I'm gonna say a goodbye, a good luck for everybody, and we will be back tomorrow so that you can check it out. And final question, Geordie Waster 84. We did cover Perisic for Tottenham, and you can check that out a little bit